Despite occasional feedback from a small minority complaining about updates on a topic, the content on this channel is driven by the interests of the viewers. Your viewing habits and preferences shape the topics I cover, ensuring that the content is what you want to see. And I can see that very clearly in the number of views and the analytics of single videos. And additionally, each day brings new viewers who are encountering these topics for the first time anyway. And that is the reason I regularly will bring updates on topics I talked about before. The world, and especially politics, are developing in a fast pace anyway. And deadlines, we all know this, we're moving so many times that it will be hard for many to follow. So I will keep an eye on these topics just for you. And this includes today's topic. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union in 2016 set in motion a series of profound changes in the relationship between the two entities. And one of the most direct and tangible impacts for British citizens is the upcoming implementation of new EU border controls. Soon, British travellers will be required to have their photographs taken, provide fingerprints and pay an entry fee when crossing into EU countries. And this shift marks a significant change from the freedom of movement British citizens once enjoyed within the EU. And for many, it represents a humiliating reminder of the rights and privileges lost due to Brexit. The new requirements have sparked a range of reactions within the UK, particularly among anti-EU groups, some of whom claim that these measures are intended to punish the UK for leaving the EU. However, this narrative is largely based on misconceptions. And this video explores the implications of these new border controls, the varied reactions within the UK, and the broader geopolitical context that frames these developments. As part of its efforts to enhance security and manage migration, the EU is set to introduce the Entry-Exit System, or EES, and the European Travel Information and Authorization System, ETIAS. These systems, expected to be fully operational this year, will apply to all non-EU nationals, including British citizens. The EES will involve the collection of biometric data, specifically fingerprints and facial images, from travellers at the EU's external borders. And additionally, under the ETIAS system, British citizens will be required to obtain a pre-travel authorization and pay a small fee before entering the EU that's similar to the US ESTA system. For British citizens, these new requirements represent a dramatic departure from the pre-Brexit era, when they could move freely across the EU without the need for visas, biometric checks or entry fees. The imposition of these new barriers underscores the reality of the UK's new status as a third country outside the EU, subject to the same rules and regulations as other non-EU nations. For many, the introduction of these controls is not just an inconvenience but a humiliation, symbolizing the loss of freedoms and benefits that came with EU membership. The response within the UK to the impending border checks has been deeply divided, reflecting the enduring rift over Brexit. Among those who supported leaving the EU, there has been significant backlash against what they perceive as a punitive measure imposed by the EU, and certain anti-EU figures in the UK have framed the new border checks as a deliberate attempt by the EU to punish the UK for Brexit, reinforcing a narrative of European vindictiveness and animosity towards the UK. This narrative, however, is largely based on a misunderstanding of the EU's intentions. The biometric checks and entry fees are part of a broader EU policy designed to enhance border security and are not targeted specifically at the UK. These measures will apply to all non-EU countries, including long-standing allies such as the United States, Canada, and Australia. However, the perception that the EU is singling out the UK for punishment has gained traction among some segments of the British population, fueled by the ongoing political and cultural tensions that have marked the post-Brexit era. For many who supported Brexit, the new border controls are seen as evidence that the EU is treating the UK unfairly and seeking to make an example of it to discourage other countries from considering a similar path. Nobody will, though. This belief reflects the deep mistrust that still exists between some British citizens and the EU, a legacy of the contentious Brexit negotiations and the polarized debate that preceded and followed the referendum. On the other side of the debate, many of those who supported remaining in the EU viewed the new border controls as unfortunate but inevitable as a consequence of Brexit. And for these individuals, the loss of freedom of movement and the imposition of these new barriers are clear examples of how Brexit has diminished the rights and privileges of British citizens. They see the new requirements as a stark reminder of the costs associated with leaving the EU, lamenting the loss of the easy borderless travel that once characterized the UK's membership in the European Union. The implementation of these border controls is a direct consequence of the UK's status as a third country in relation to the EU. When the UK left the EU, it also has left the single market and the customs union, forfeiting the rights and privileges that came with EU membership. And as a third country, the UK is now subject to the same rules and regulations that apply to other non-EU countries, including the new border security measures. And this shift in status is significant because it underscores the broader geopolitical and economic realignment that has occurred as a result of Brexit. The UK, once a central player within the EU, now finds itself outside the bloc with limited influence over its policies and regulations. And the new border controls are a tangible manifestation of this new reality, highlighting the practical implications of the UK's decision to leave the EU. For British citizens, this change in status means that they will be treated no differently from citizens of other third countries when entering the EU. The requirement to provide fingerprints, have a photograph taken, and pay an entry fee serves as a stark reminder of the new barriers that have arisen between the UK and many of its European neighbours. This is particularly galling for those who had hoped that Brexit would enhance the UK's sovereignty and global standing, only to find that it has led to new restrictions and complications in their interactions with the rest of Europe. The loss of freedom of movement has had significant implications for both personal and professional travel. British citizens who once enjoyed the ease of crossing EU borders for work, study, or leisure now face a more cumbersome process marked by additional bureaucracy and the need for pre-authorization. The new requirements also raise concerns about the long-term implication for the UK's relationship with Europe, as the ease of cross-border movement was a cornerstone of the close ties that once existed between the UK and the EU. And the narrative that the EU is deliberately punishing the UK through these new border controls is a misconception that has been propagated by certain anti-EU groups in the UK. In reality, as I said, the EU's new border security measures are part of a long-planned strategy to modernize and secure its external borders. The ES and the ETIAS systems are being introduced across the board for all non-EU countries, not just the UK, and are indeed intended to enhance security and streamline border crossings. However, the perception of punishment persists, fueled by the ongoing political and cultural tensions between the UK and the EU. And I cannot change the fact that Brexiteers are still doing those claims. The TCA was punishment. No, the withdrawal agreement, we have to start there, was punishment of the EU for the UK. I'm just talking about fishing rights, border controls and everything like this. We heard that. Then the TCA was a punishment from the EU to the UK. They're claiming that all the time. And everything that's happening now, which is just a reality brought by Brexit, And this is all a natural consequence of the country's changed relationship with the EU, and they don't want to understand. They don't want to see the damage brought by Brexit because they were for the Brexit. They don't want to see that this is just adjusting to reality, and that the border controls are a direct result of the UK decision. And while they may be inconvenient or even humiliating for some, they are necessary as part of the new post-Brexit reality. And these measures are just consistent with the EU's broader efforts to enhance the security and manage migration across its borders. The introduction of biometric checks and pre-travel authorization is intended to improve the security of the Schengen area by ensuring that all travelers entering the EU are properly vetted. And while this may create additional hurdles for British citizens, it is just part of a global trend toward increased security and digitization at borders, not targeted as an effort to punish the UK. And the soon-to-be implemented EU border controls requiring British citizens to provide fingerprints, photographs, etc. are a significant shift. But the decision was not made by the EU in the first place. It was made by the British voters that went to the vote on that day. For many British citizens, these new requirements are seen as a humiliation and a stark contrast to the freedom of movement they once enjoyed within the EU. And the reactions within the UK, although mixed, are sometimes quite hilarious when they see it as punitive measures. Once again, they are just inevitable consequences of Brexit. And so that's another reason why I had to make this video once again, to clearly fight against those populist things that are still running around there. In many cases, Britain has the same stand now as Mongolia. We talked about this earlier. The UK is just treated as a third country. And by the way, third country and third world country are two different things. Some of the people commenting under the videos and are not very friendly people don't even get that difference. Yes, the UK is a third country from the point of view of the EU, of course, but for every other country in the world as well. So that is just a technical term which applies absolutely to the UK from the point of view of the EU since Brexit. And the loss of freedom of movement and the imposition of new barriers reflect, as I said, the broader consequence of Brexit. Not only in terms of practical travel, but also in the symbolic loss of the close ties that once existed. And as the UK continues to navigate all this post-Brexit stuff, the challenge will be to reconcile these new realities with the aspirations that led to the country's departure from the EU. But those answers need to be given by Brexiteers that still have not done it. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.